Russia launched a wave of missiles and drones at Ukraine overnight, targeting several cities including Kyiv, Dnipro and Odessa. In Kyiv, the attack killed at least 5 people, including a child. Dozens of others were injured. The attack caused extensive damage, including to several residential buildings, some of where large fires broke out, as well as a hotel. Russia's attacks continued in the morning on Thursday. Kyiv's mayor reported that a low-flying drone crashed into an 18-story building. Dnipro also came under heavy fire. It marked the second time the city was targeted this week, according to local media. Fires broke out in several residential neighborhoods. Local authorities reported 2 people have been killed and dozens injured. And several explosions were reported in Odessa, where 7 people were killed and at least 11 injured. According to the Kyiv Independent, last night's Russian attack was one of the deadliest on Ukrainian civilians this year. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces attacked Russia's Tuapse port, which is home to a major oil export terminal and refinery. According to Russian officials and media, the attack killed 2 children and sparked a large fire.
The White House says discussions are being had to arrange a second round of peace talks with Iran and Pakistan within the coming days.
Russia launched a wave of missiles and drones at Ukraine overnight, targeting several cities including Kyiv, Dnipro and Odessa. In Kyiv, the attack killed at least 5 people, including a child. Dozens of others were injured. The attack caused extensive damage, including to several residential buildings, some of where large fires broke out, as well as a hotel. Russia's attacks continued in the morning on Thursday. Kyiv's mayor reported that a low-flying drone crashed into an 18-story building. Dnipro also came under heavy fire. It marked the second time the city was targeted this week, according to local media. Fires broke out in several residential neighborhoods. Local authorities reported 2 people have been killed and dozens injured. Several explosions were reported in Odessa, where 7 people were killed and at least 11 injured. According to the Kyiv Independent, last night's Russian attack was one of the deadliest on Ukrainian civilians this year. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces attacked Russia's Tuapse port, which is home to a major oil export terminal and refinery. According to Russian officials and media, the attack killed 2 children and sparked a large fire.
Following her fallout with Donald Trump, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is closing ranks with Ukraine. During a bilateral meeting with President Volodymyr Zelensky in Rome on Wednesday, Meloni confirmed, quote, full support for Kyiv and announced interest in a joint drone production initiative between Italy and Ukraine. Another success for Kyiv's defense industry following cooperation agreements signed in Berlin and Oslo.
L'Italia continuerà a promuovere in sede G7 e in sede di Unione Europea la pressione economica sulla Federazione Russa, che continua a non mostrare segnali concreti nel percorso negoziale, insiste negli attacchi contro i civili, persevera nel colpire le infrastrutture indispensabili per la popolazione.
During the summit in Rome, Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky also met with the Italian head of state Sergio Mattarella, who reaffirmed Italy's backing for Kyiv's accession process to the European Union.
About 120,000 drones pledged by the UK, alongside additional funding for NATO Pearl program, were announced at a meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group in Berlin on Wednesday.
Drones have defined this war. They will be decisive to its outcome. That's why I'm announcing today the UK's biggest package of drones into Ukraine this year. Over 120,000 new drones will be delivered from the UK into Ukraine. We'll also provide hundreds of thousands of artillery rounds and thousands of air defence missiles, which together will help Ukraine defend its territory and strike back against Russian aggression.
German Defense Minister reiterated Berlin's latest military commitments, announced on Tuesday during German-Ukrainian government consultations, where the two sides signed a €4 billion defense package, including hundreds of Patriot missiles and joint drone production, as well as an agreement to share digital battlefield data. Ukraine's defense minister added that drones are responsible for the bulk of Ukraine's counterattacks and are critical on both the battlefield and in strikes behind enemy lines.
The United States says a second round of peace talks with Iran is being discussed, most likely to be held in Pakistan within the coming days. Pakistani delegations, including Field Marshal Asim Munir, were in Tehran to meet with officials and work out the details. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt announced the news on Wednesday after President Donald Trump earlier indicated that the war could be over very soon and that a deal is near.
We remain very much engaged in these negotiations, in these talks. You heard from the Vice President directly and the President this week that these conversations are productive and ongoing, and that's where we are right now. We feel good about the prospects of a deal. The President mentioned that in his interview yesterday, and it's obviously in the best interest of Iran to meet the President's demands. I think he's made his red lines in these negotiations very clear to the other side, and so we are continuing to see how these conversations go.
Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif also visited the Red Sea port city of Jeddah on Wednesday to discuss the ongoing peace efforts with Saudi officials. Islamabad says it's committed to bridging the gaps between the warring sides, restore peace to the region, and reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
Lebanon is engaged in direct diplomatic talks with Israel for the first time in 30 years, with the aim of ending fighting between Israel and the Hezbollah. The talks are taking place in Washington and are mediated by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
The number one objective at this stage is the end of hostilities and the cessation of the violence. Lebanon has paid an extremely high price and continues to pay an extremely high price, both in terms of death, injured, as well as massive displacement.
More than 2,000 Lebanese have been killed and around 1.2 million people have been internally displaced since Israel launched an air offensive followed by a ground invasion in March. Asked how Lebanon would circumvent Hezbollah's demilitarization refusal while seeking to convince Israel to end hostilities, Bissat hinted that the paramilitary group would eventually be pressured to disarm by popular demand.
We're counting on the national consensus at this point that nobody wants violence internally.
The fragile ceasefire reached between Israel, the US and Iran last week was not extended to Lebanon.
3 days after his party's landslide election victory, Peter Mayer says he has called for an early transfer of power as soon as possible during talks with Hungary's President Tamás Sullyok. Speaking at a press conference in front of the presidential palace, Mayer told reporters he wanted the inaugural meeting of the new National Assembly to be held on the 4th of May, the day that official election results are expected to be released.
Abban maradtunk, hogy az elnök úr ennél korábban a lehető legkorábbi időpontra fogja összehívni az alakulóülést. Ő is úgy gondolja, és szerintem mindenki úgy gondolja, hogy a magyar nemzet érdeke, hogy egy ilyen erős választói felhatalmazás után a lehető leggyorsabban megtörténjen a kormányváltás és egyben rendszerváltás is. Elmondtam neki, hogy ha nem távozik önként a hivatalából, akkor élni fogunk a választóktól kapott felhatalmazással és alaptörvény módosítással és a szükséges módosításokkal el fogjuk távolítani a hivatalából őt is és az összes többi bábot, akit az Orbán rendszer nevezett ki a helyére, legyen szó legfőbb ügyészről vagy éppen az Alkotmánybíróság elnökéről. Elnök úr sejtelmes választ adott erre a felvetésemre, azt mondta, hogy ő is természetesen szeretné megőrizni a jogállamot, Magyarország külföldi kifele történő reputációját és hírnevét, megfontolja, azt mondta elnök úr, a felhozott érveimet a távozásával kapcsolatban.
Maria, over 2 years, attracted a cross-section of public support his Titsa party, which swept the ruling Fidesz from power on Sunday.
Magyar Péter a Sándor-palotához egyenesen a közmédiából érkezett, ahol másfél év után először volt vendég, előbb a Kossuth Rádióban, majd pedig az M1-en. Mindkét stúdióban elmondta, hogy amint kormányra kerülnek, ideiglenesen leállítják a közmédia hírszolgáltatását. Kónya Rita, Euronews, Budapest.
In the wake of Donald Trump's attacks on Giorgia Meloni, Palazzo Chigi is trying to play down the blow. It's not the end of the world. We've simply said what we think, government sources say. But the rift has been clear-cut, with the US president describing himself as shocked by Meloni's stance in solidarity with the Pope. Donald Trump had described the Pope as weak and terrible at foreign policy.
La situazione internazionale è una situazione che bisogna continuare sulla quale bisogna continuare a lavorare per mandare avanti i negoziati di pace, fare ogni sforzo possibile per stabilizzare la situazione e riaprire lo stretto che per noi è fondamentale, chiaramente non solo per i carburanti ma anche per i fertilizzanti, altro elemento fondamentale per il settore del quale parliamo oggi.
Prior to the criticism, the Prime Minister had reiterated Italy's commitment to peace in the Middle East.
Il rapporto dell'Italia con gli Stati Uniti è un rapporto che va avanti da qualche anno, no? E non riguarda il singolo governo. Noi cerchiamo di fare il nostro meglio, chiaramente a contesto dato, considerando gli Stati Uniti un nostro alleato strategico e prioritario, però quando si è amici e quando si ha degli alleati, particolarmente se sono strategici, bisogna anche avere il coraggio di dire quando non si è d'accordo, che è quello che io faccio ogni giorno. Quando sono d'accordo dico di essere d'accordo, quando non sono d'accordo dico di non essere d'accordo, perché credo che questo faccia bene all'Europa, agli Stati Uniti e all'Occidente in generale.
Following Trump's attacks, Meloni simply reiterated the point: being allies does not mean being subject. She declared,
Here to help on that.